Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the legacy of the Mothman and the legacy of John A. Keel, the author of the Mothman Prophecies. My guest today is Brent Raynes, who has been involved in ufology since the age of 14, and that was 55 years ago. He is author of Visitors from Hidden Realms. On the Edge of Reality, Dream Weavers, The Mastering of Time and Space, and most recently, John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries. He is also editor of Alternate Perceptions, an online magazine founded in 1985. It's been online since 2001 and is currently on issue number 290. Brent lives in Waynesboro, Tennessee, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Brent. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, Jeff, it's certainly a pleasure and an honor to be a guest on your show.
You've been involved in the field of ufology ever since you were a teenager, which is a long time now. And today we're going to focus on the Mothman Prophecies, John Keel's famous book, and the legacy of John Keel himself. I think one of the first things that we should call attention to, because some of our viewers will undoubtedly have seen the film, The Mothman Prophecies, that came out in 2002, is that film doesn't really tell the story that John Keel wrote about.
No, it really doesn't. There was a lot more to it. I did talk with Keel after the movie came out on the phone, and he said that he was happy that it created the atmosphere of how it felt at the time during his investigation and people, what they were going through, the anomalous activity that occurred. But he said it had that Hollywood touch to it, and but he was pleased with it himself.
I'm under the impression, now it's been a long time since I've seen the movie, and it deals with the intuition that something terrible was going to happen, and then the Silver Bridge collapsed. 46 people were killed. But as I recall, the movie doesn't really make much of the many appearances of the creature referred to as the Mothman that occurred in that Ohio River Valley.
Right. There's a whole history of for years, paranormal activity through that area, and this was a part that caught his attention, and in fact, he was in the area of West Virginia at the time, investigating. He was interested in all sorts of unusual stories. And one at the time was a story that was in the newspapers a few years earlier about a family that owned a cat that had these appendages that were kind of like wings. And by coincidence, while he was in West Virginia investigating that, these four young people near Point Pleasant claimed they had encountered what later became referred to as the Mothman. And that's when he got involved, and he made I think in 1967, about 5 different trips to the Point Pleasant area. He even, skywatched on nearby hills to see if he could catch a glimpse of some of the UFO activity or the Mothman or whatever. Originally, it was called simply the Bird. But at the time, Batman was a popular TV program, and some journalists decided in an article to call it the Mothman. So that's how that came about. But Keel had some very interesting experiences doing these investigations. He realized a lot of the Mothman witnesses, UFO witnesses, were having unusual psychic experiences, poltergeist activity breaking out. He'd even come to the conclusion that ufology should be a branch of parapsychology. And I actually was lucky enough in working on this book, John A. Keel, The Man, the Myths, and the Ongoing Mysteries, that I wrote and had published in 2019. I reached out to Dan Drazen, who is a documentary producer who currently lives in California, but at the time he was in New York City, and he had recently seen a UFO, and he approached John Keel at one of his talks, and Keel invited him to come with him to West Virginia. And he met quite a number of the people. He had plans on making a documentary for a PBS affiliate in New York City. He had one of the people come down there with him. He saw strange objects. He had some very unusual experiences himself. And unfortunately, at the last minute, the company decided, they weren't going to fund the project. But he was ready to do that. And this experience originally, Keel thought, back in '66 when he started investigating these things full time for a couple or so years, that he had the standard idea, as a lot of people do, that it was nuts and bolts ET visitations. But then he realized that there were so many other complex elements to this, and certainly Point Pleasant was one area that he came to realize quite quickly that there was some things that were really, really strange. And he even observed one night as he was on a hilltop by himself. It was early morning, and he's listening to a New York radio station, eating a candy bar, and suddenly, almost like a classic flying saucer, just whizzed by his automobile and seemed to go down into a gully just beyond his car. And he said, admittedly, although he was used to walking through graveyards and desolate places and being up late at night and sky watching, this unnerved him. He locked all the doors and was afraid, something else was going to happen. But anyway, there's a lot to the Keel story. I had the pleasure of actually, as a young teenager, writing him for the first time in October 1969, and beginning correspondence with him. And I asked him at one point, how could I investigate these things myself? I'm certainly was developing quite an interest. I had a little mimeograph newsletter, which I actually used to exchange copies with him of his Anomaly newsletter that he put out at the time, dealing with a lot of the findings that he was uncovering, and sometimes of newspaper clippings he would include in it. So we exchanged correspondence, and over the years, sometimes phone calls and such. And I developed a great deal of respect for him and his approach, and getting out into the field and actually meeting the people and hearing the whole story and doing what I guess you call an unstructured interview, where you listen to the story you came to hear, say a flying saucer landing or something, and then you ask them about other things unusual that have happened to them, over the course of their lifetime. And, and a lot of times you hear all sorts of other very anomalous experiences that a lot of the ufologists at the time, when they go and interview witnesses, they're not looking for. It could have been a poltergeist manifestation, cryptid type thing, an apparition, a ghost. In fact, in 1970, he wrote in one of his books, Strange Creatures from Time and Space, paraphrasing here, but it was to the effect that ghost, aliens, take your pick. Not sure there was a whole lot of difference. The reports of aliens often have apparitional appearances, and so when I asked him what I should do, he recommended a book I read on apparitions. He recommended I study studies on, hauntings and Marian apparitions, religious experiences. He felt they all had very similar elements.
And he was really one of the very first people to make this connection that such diverse things as cryptozoology and ufology and parapsychology, religious miracles, were all part of a single phenomenon.
Well, he was certainly one of the early pioneers who really was making that clear at a time when ufology, it wasn't popular at all to write and speak of such things because a lot of the researchers were quite biased in their point of view. And, they were really essentially only looking for confirmation bias. If they consulted with a psychologist about a witness, it was simply to find out if the person was sane or not. But really, as we realize more and more now, consciousness and physics are the main areas we've got to study and see how it all interconnects. And at a deeper, there's so much to unpack here. I mean, you've got psychology, you've got parapsychology, you've got physics, quantum physics, classic physics, and all of these areas have to be all studied together, multidisciplinary, and a lot of people just aren't getting along. The cryptozoologist doesn't want to share his information with a ufologist, like that's a waste of my time, and they look at it as a separate discipline, when in reality we should be looking at all of this as Keel did, as potentially interrelated.
One of the very interesting facts I learned from reading your book about John Keel is that in the city of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, they hold an annual Mothman Festival each year.
Yes, they've been doing that, since I think maybe 2001 or 2002. And Keel actually attended one of them back in 2003 when they unveiled the Mothman statue off of the main street of Point Pleasant. And at those gatherings, I mean, it's unbelievable. A little town of maybe about 5,000 people. Suddenly there's over 10,000, and you're looking for parking places. But it's quite an event. You get people from different fields who go there, and there's a local theater, an old theater there where they have a stage that people, researchers in various areas of cryptozoology or ufology or parapsychology get up and present their findings to anyone who wants to come in and listen. And there's actually a Mothman Museum on the main street. In fact, the owner actually has written a couple books of people he's interviewed who had Mothman recollections. And there's a lot of exhibits of newspaper clippings and videos, and even John Keel's jacket that he wore when he was visiting Point Pleasant Mothman Festival in 2003. So, which I did a little recording while I was standing in there, hoping maybe I'd get an EVP, but I didn't.
Well, we will talk about EVP because I know you have endeavored to reach out and contact John Keel since his death. I believe it was in 2009. But before we go there, Brent, I think many of our viewers are still kind of scratching their heads and asking, well, what is this Mothman? Maybe you could describe how the various witnesses referred to this creature.
There were a number of sightings that occurred, and some of the researchers in ufology at the time thought, no, this is nonsense. They were even harassing some of the citizens, I understand, calling them up on the phone saying, come on, Keel paid you to say this or whatever. It wasn't just Keel, though. I mean, I've actually been in touch with a researcher from Sweden who came over in 1969 and 1970 on 2 occasions, spent several weeks, interviewed about 30 of the witnesses himself, came up with many of the same anomalous details. Now, a lot of the eyes, there's been a controversy about the red glowing eyes. The eyes often seem to have almost a hypnotic effect on the witnesses. They really frightened them. And this was a big, tall, 6-7 foot bird from head to toe, had wings, large wingspan. And the anomalous thing was it would like stretch its wings apart, as some witnesses describe, but without flapping them, it would just suddenly shoot straight up in the air. And I know the gentleman from Sweden said that people, he met a lot of the people, the families, and said that again and again, these witnesses, the family members, friends, would tell him again and again that they're not the same person. It was very traumatic, the experience, and it left a long-lasting effect. And I think some of them became smokers afterwards, And And he also came across, as Keel did, instances where people afterwards had poltergeist effects, unusual phone anomalies. And again and again, these same elements cropping up. And so that's what I, was quite fascinated with, too, and when I started my own field investigative work.
So the point, I guess, of the book, The Mothman Prophecies, originally published, as I recall, in 1975, some years after the original investigation, is that the people who were encountering this Mothman creature and were frightened by it. As I recall, in one case, the creature seemed to chase them some distance into the town of Point Pleasant, where they reported it to the sheriff. These people began experiencing a whole host of paranormal experiences, in particular, premonitions relating to the bridge that collapsed.
I was in Point Pleasant with some friends from the Cincinnati area one time, Cincinnati, Ohio, back in weekend back in May of 1976, so a little less than 10 years after all this had broken out. And I got to meet one of those witnesses, Linda Scarberry, who was one of the original people that, her and three other people that were in the TNT area that night, young people, and this thing with these big red eyes had been seen and flew over their car on the way back to Point Pleasant. Very frightened, went to the police about it, and the police were quite impressed, that these teenagers really seemed upset. And so years later, I happened to be in Point Pleasant. I actually go to the house, meet her mom and dad and some other family members, and I hear all these stories about doors opening and shutting and unusual odors and even like apparitional figures. And I also talked with a Mrs. Thompson, who Keel had written about, who had seen this unusual figure back in November 1966 in the TNT area where her husband worked and they lived. And it was a storm was coming up, and she went outside to cover up some motorcycles. And while she was outside, noticed across the road that there was this tall, dark figure. Now, she didn't see any wings, but it was a tall humanoid type figure with, there was a noise like a broken fan belt. And she said her ears were kind of popping, making a popping noise, and her attention was focused on it. She said it moved like lightning across the field. She couldn't imagine anybody being able to move that fast. And she concluded in her mind that it was a robot. But she was unable to break this, it was like she was in a trance. And she was one of the people that had dreamed that there was going to be a disaster on the Ohio River. Didn't know just what it was going to be. And she told me that she'd had other premonitions like that, over her throughout her life. She even told me about a fire at a jail in Point Pleasant where several people died. So apparently this wasn't all that uncommon to her, And this kind of goes along with Keel's idea that he expressed early on, that a lot of these people have some form of psychic sensitivity that opens them up for a lot of anomalous things, whether it be a flying saucer observation, some sort of unusual creature, apparition, poltergeist activity, whatever. There's a whole wide range of things that, as you well know, could be, discussed, debated, pondered, explored, dissected, and questioned.
Well, John Keel, as I recall from your book, was a Fortean. In fact, I think he organized a local branch in New York City of the Fortean Society following the works of Charles Fort.
That's correct, yes. Of course, Charles Fort wrote of, he would, go to libraries and collect all sorts of unusual stories from meteorological journals to newspaper accounts of unusual accounts of all sorts of things. And he wrote 4 books altogether during his lifetime of this sort. And Keel was, he was someone who read all kinds of things. He was a reading machine. And he was fascinated by a lot of the things that Fort described. So he considered himself kind of open-minded in that respect as Charles Fort. He looked at all these different things, be it airships or strange apparitional figures or whatever the case may be.
If one were to go through just Fort's 4 books, I think you would find over 1,000 instances of inexplicable events, things like frogs raining down from the sky.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was back in the early 80s. I wrote for the local newspaper, and we had one of those cases here that a woman had described, and I called my column the odds and ends. And so I tried to find local stories, that were kind of like that. And at first it was the editors considered it kind of humorous and interesting. But as I wrote about other things, UFOs and Bigfoot, I think they thought, oh my God, this guy's serious about this. So, it lasted only for a short while. But these stories, and they're all over. I mean, it's not just Point Pleasant, West Virginia, or certain window areas, as Keel called it, areas where, anomalous activity seems to reoccur over, maybe centuries in some locations. But sometimes it's the people themselves who are unique and who have some kind of, for whatever reason. And that's something that's, there's a lot of theories about. I know that you've got a number of scientists who are trying to find out what that X factor is, what makes some people susceptible and prone to these experiences. I've known people that would talk about, having these experiences in a house that was haunted. And then they'd go on saying, I lived in this other house that was haunted. And then, and there was another one. It was like, no, wait, it's not the house necessarily. It's it's you, I think, maybe.
As I recall from your biography, you've also interacted a fair amount with Native Americans who seem to have a greater familiarity with this type of phenomena.
That's something that, back in the 70s, I was traveling around and I met a woman up in Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio, near Akron, and she was a contactee. She had some Native American ancestry, and she told me about this incredible Native American medicine man who also had contact with these beings from outer space, but they were part of his culture, the Udushqua. These were ancient beings of his own culture. And he claimed they were very tall, giant figures, and they would come to his house there in Pennsylvania. And so I went down there twice and interviewed him. And, it was, he had some amazing stories. Yeah, his wife showed me a drawing of a craft she called the fire canoe that landed in their backyard one time. And these tall beings came out and came into the house and spoke with them.
I think it's fascinating that these reports of creatures and other sorts of paranormal activity, John Keel had 2 terms that he seemed to emphasize. You've mentioned the one, windows, that they occur, it appears in certain geographical locations where the window or the portal maybe to another dimension exists. And the other term he uses is waves, that they seem to be associated or connected through time, that they lots of phenomena seem to appear in waves, in groups.
And he looked at, wrote about the electromagnetic spectrum and how there may be a force within it that he called the superspectrum that he said he was writing a kind of a simplified version at the time of quantum physics, but that, maybe there were certain solar flare activity or something that was going on that maybe affected the geomagnetic landscape in certain areas. Certain areas that In fact, back in the day, he was actually emphasizing that investigators should get these geomagnetic survey maps that the U.S. Geological Survey had done this study back in the 50s and 60s, sending planes out across the North American landscape, and from those planes having instrumentation that would detect areas where there were, geomagnetic anomalies, and seeing how UFO activity in their areas compared to these particular sites. And of course, Keel felt it wasn't necessarily extraterrestrial. It was, he called it ultra-terrestrial because it seemed to be a part of our environment and wasn't really something that started with the UFO age that began in 1947. There were reports of similar things going back much earlier, centuries earlier, and he even questioned, well, maybe, in the Bible, maybe Ezekiel, maybe some of the prophets, they describe the wheel in the wheel and other things, mysterious chariots. Today, what would we call them? What they didn't have those kind of way of looking at things that we have in our culture today. That was a different time and a different way of looking at things. But Jacques Vallée wrote his book Passport to Magonia in 1969, comparing how the fairy faith in different cultures had a lot of similarity, these beings, to our modern abducting grays and so forth. People would disappear allegedly for a time. They would be missing time, and then they'd be brought back, find out, there'd be strange rings on the ground, that they associated with the fairy dancing. There would be sometimes these strange orbs of light. So it's a lot of things that you can look at and say, okay, we have these stories of beings and strange lights, objects in the sky that go back, way back, maybe back to as far as recorded history could go. And I think these are the important points that Keel was trying to establish, that you look at the modern and historical accounts, and a lot of this stuff seems to be interwoven. But we miss a lot of it because we get sort of hung up on a certain belief system we developed from the reports and how our culture looks at it, and perhaps how it kind of, if there is an interactive, intelligent force behind it, as I think there is myself, then it may read us and decide that it's going to conform to our expectations rather than just come out directly with something that maybe we're kind of so primitive in their viewpoint. It would be like us trying to communicate with a colony of ants. Someone has used that comparison. I don't know. I like to think we're a little more sophisticated, but ants are pretty smart in their own way.
One of the most unusual stories that impressed me in your book about John Keel had to do with the time that he was visited with one of his best friends that he hadn't seen in some 20 years, and only later did he learn that individual was deceased.
That was on December 15th, 1967. And he was back in New York City in his apartment. And on this day, an old friend, in fact, in 1950, he was a best man at his friend's wedding. And so they had known each other quite a number of years, but they hadn't seen each other in a pretty good while at this point. And he just happened to show up at his door. And they spent, it was like early afternoon right up till midnight. Now, Keel said, it was his old friend. He had his memory. It was definitely him in appearance. He had no question, It was Dan Drazen who told me this initially. He was there in the apartment when the guy was there. He shook his hand. He said he was a guy with, large hands. And Keel was definitely comfortable with the guy. It was an old friend. But then sometime later, he sent me the letter that Keel wrote him. And, he can't explain it. He says Keel wrote that he was in Macy's And there was the guy's wife. And he said, "Oh, how are you doing?" And then got around to talking about, "I saw your husband a while back." And she told him that, "I'm sorry, he's died. He died of a heart attack." And Keel said, "When did that happen?" And she said, "July of 1965. And Keel, he said, "No, that can't be. I saw him in November of 1967, over 2 years later." And she got rather indignant, he said, and said, "John, don't you think I'd know, when it was? I was there. I went through the whole ordeal, And so anyway, he wrote in the letter, Keel did, that has caused him many sleepless nights.
Well, I can say that I've known Dan Drazen for over 30 years. I respect him highly. I regard him as a person of unimpeachable integrity. So when he says that he met this individual who later turned out to have been deceased, it really is consistent with other stories that are in the literature, and there are actually many of them having to do with, the complete materialization of deceased individuals. It's certainly not the only case.
Oh, certainly not. We've even had a similar story in my own family. My wife's mother has passed away, and not long after she passed, a little over a decade ago, my daughter said that she appeared in her house and was playing with a young grandson. And, she said her grandmother was there playing with the child. She was on the couch and, she'd been sleeping. She woke up and saw this and was like, "What are you doing here?" And, it was like, "Yeah, just it's okay. We're just playing." And then the sun started coming up, and she said she started going out the door, and she says, "Do you need me to take you somewhere?" And said that her grandmother said, "You know better than that. You know where I'm going. You can't go right now." And said she walked toward the sun, and she just sort of faded off while she was trying to see her in the sun, and then she was just gone. So, I realize there's other stories out there, and that's one I can attest to from my own family.
Earlier, we spoke of EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, and I know there are tens of thousands of hobbyists who endeavor to communicate with their deceased friends and relatives, or maybe even strangers, using computers, using radios, using devices. I think one of them is called the Spirit Box. And after Keel died, you attempted to establish communication with him yourself.
Well, I know after he died, I was thinking, what a tremendous loss, and I had that personal connection with him. I was going to miss him, and he passed away July 3rd of 2009, and he was 79 years old. His health hadn't been really all that good, unfortunately. But I had met a few months later a gentleman named Brent Oldham. And at the time I met him, I just knew that he was really into being doing paranormal investigations. And I didn't know till later that he was actually someone who was an alien experiencer, encountered a ghost and an alien both in separate experiences back about 5 years of age. And he had this kind of sensitivity to repeated encounters with aliens and ghosts, and of course I couldn't help when I heard all that of what John Keel had said about, what's the difference. But anyway, he was using the ghost box, and it was like a Radio Shack, AM, FM digital radio, and he would turn it on continuous scan and have it where he would listen for voices that were like in the white noise area of it. And I was kind of skeptical. In fact, first time we attended one of his sessions, I watched over the grandson while my daughter and my wife, went with some others to try it. And afterwards, I heard about how a voice said, my wife's name, Joan, and then Jesse, which was her brother who has passed away. And I thought, well, that's quite an interesting coincidence. So anyway, then we did some investigations, which I was involved with, and John Keel came through, And I've been thinking about, privately, John, can you come through? And then, lo and behold, here it was happening. So on July 3rd of 2010, it was just a year later. And I asked the group, we met at a friend's house, Sandy Nichols, up in Thompson Station below Nashville. And I said, you care if we try to reach out to John Keel? And so I think we had 3 recorders recording. We had Ghost Box hooked up to a stereo speakers that were very loud. We had to yell to to be heard. And we got some great recordings. There was Brett saying, can you have him say John Keel? And like a second or two later, a male voice says John Keel. And then he had, Brett had seen, when he was a teenager, Bigfoot in Ohio, and Keel was interested in Mothman and Bigfoot and all cryptids. So he asked him, what can you tell us about Bigfoot? And it definitely said Bigfoot, but it sounded like he said, smuck Bigfoot, see? And we're like, what? and then there were like 2 other voices in the background, see. And then I asked, John, what can you tell us about Jadoo? Because Jadoo, black magic in the Orient, back in 1957, he made this trip for several months across from Egypt all the way to Singapore, going through Tibet and places where, he was interested in the magicians and the holy men and all that, and even tracked a Yeti that was being reported, saw the footprints, heard the call, thought maybe he'd seen one day, but he couldn't tell if it was on the other side of a lake. Might have been a bear, but, he was writing to a newspaper editor or magazine editor, that was it, who was helping to finance his trip, and telling him the story. And the guy, he said, the magazine editor said, well, just say it was Bigfoot, Keel. That's real popular right now, or Yeti. But anyway, we did, we got those interactions. And he did say Jadoo, a voice said Jadoo. And so I thought, well, got to strike while the iron's hot. So I asked again, yes, what can you tell us about Jadoo? And everybody heard it. We recorded it and said, well, what it sounds like, it kept breaking up, but it was this voice going on and on, into the fire. And as I reflected on it, well, if you're talking about black magic, I guess into the fire might make sense. And then it kind of faded out, and then it came back a little and says, teach me outside. And in my mind, if it's Keel or someone with knowledge of Keel and how he thought, then teach me outside would be like he was someone who was intrigued by all these different cultures, about learning from going out in the field and getting the information from the source whenever he could. It sounded like this could be Keel, In fact, a little over a month earlier, we'd been at a haunted site, and twice Brett recorded John Keel on his Ghost Box, coming through the Ghost Box, the radio on AM frequency. And also, again, Brett asked about... someone said they'd seen Bigfoot, and he asked, what was it? And what was causing the tree wraps, which Bigfoot's supposed to do? And this voice said, monster. And that got me excited. I produced a letter, the first letter that Keel wrote me. In 1969, he said, I'm writing a book, an encyclopedia on monsters. And I said, for Keel, it wasn't Bigfoot. It wasn't cryptids. He always talked about monsters. And I showed him the copy of the book that, he was talking about, the later written Strange Creatures from Time and Space. In the very first chapter, the very first page, he starts out talking about monsters. And I said, what a coincidence. We get John Keel and we're asking him about, a supposed Bigfoot, and he says monsters. Perhaps one of the most humorous things that ever happened was one time we were trying to, I said, John Keel, let's try an experiment. I'm going to mention some names and you tell me what you think. And I knew he had many people he disagreed with. And so I shot out some names. And when I was reviewing it later, I had the headphones on, and there was this voice that to me sounded like John Keel. And it says, what do you think about this person, that person? He says, and what I think about you. And I thought, well, Keel had quite a wicked sense of humor.
Well, Brent, this has been a fabulous conversation. What a wealth of experience you have. I want to encourage our viewers to check out your book. I think one of the most interesting aspects of it is that you've interviewed maybe a dozen researchers who knew Keel themselves and who were influenced by him. So like myself, you're an interviewer. And like myself, you have an encyclopedia of knowledge, so I'm very hopeful that we'll have many more conversations in the future.
Well, that would be great. I sure appreciate you inviting me on to your program. It's a wonderful program. I've watched quite a number of your episodes, and you're doing greatest interviews out there, really. So I'm honored to be one of your guests. So thank you very much.
Thank you for being with me, Brent, and for those of you listening or watching, thank you for being with us.